Again, we're continuing the conversation here on Is It Prophecy on Israel National Radio. Arut Sheva, and the show is on YouTube under Messiah Hour. Our guest this afternoon is historian and Rabbi Ken Spiro. Rabbi Spiro, let's go back to the blood moons we discussed, not just in May, but at the beginning of the program, that we got through two of them, and now we have two more. Can you just explain to our audience who didn't hear that episode, that interview in May, what exactly is the blood moon cycle and how it relates to the verses in Yoel?
Right. So again, first to be clear, the blood moon idea is a much more prevalent idea in the Christian world than it is in the Jewish world. The connection of Jews and the moon in Jewish sources is a lot harder to see. But the concept, astronomically speaking, is when you get 4 lunar eclipses in a row with no interceding partial lunar eclipses. It's called a tetrad, a blood moon tetrad. And because what happens when the Earth's shadow is cast on the moon, it tends to look a very reddish color. That's the idea of a blood moon. So it's considered that eclipses have always had significance, not just for Jews, but for the whole world. It's always viewed as an omen, usually not a very good one. And it happens to be we have this thing called a tetrad, of these 4 eclipses happening in the space of 2 years, and they fall out precisely on major Jewish holidays, although not all of them are visible in Israel. Only the last one is going to be. But we had one on the first night of Sukkot, the Tabernacles. Then we have one on Passover, the eve of the Passover Seder. We're going to have another one coming up in the next Sukkot, and then another one in the Passover. Actually, it's the Passover coming up, and then the Sukkot after that. So the final one will be Sukkot in Jerusalem, which will be visible, and I believe also on Rosh Hashanah of next year, or maybe it was, I'm losing track now, there was a partial solar eclipse, I think, in this Rosh Hashanah, actually, excuse me. So it's being viewed as a very serious omen, and the last 2 times that this has happened came out in 1948-49, which was right after beginning at the end of Israel's War of Independence, and the year that came after, and of course in 1967, which of course was the reunification of Jerusalem. And there are sometimes periods in history where they happen quite frequently, which is what's happened in the last 70 years, and then we go for whole centuries without having it at all. So that's the basic concept. And again, many Christians have read into this, that this is an omen of big things are going to happen in the world, to the Jewish people, to the world in general.
And Pastor Hagee actually wrote a book about this, and the title was Something in Israel is About to Change. That was his title. It wasn't a chapter or something in his book, the verse of his book. That was his title. So let's go with this to put a bit, take the gloves off a bit. How come the Christian world could see this a little bit better than the Jewish world, even the firm Jewish world?
Well, it's 2 things. One is the Christian world, of course, reads much more into this than the Jewish world. We definitely believe God controls the world, although, again, in Jewish sources, this is not the moon is associated with the Jews, and by the way, lunar eclipses are in general in Jewish thought not considered to be good omens for Jews. Why is the moon associated with the Jewish people? Because we keep our calendar by the moon. The new months are according to the cycle of the moon, which is the cycle that every month. That's a Jewish month. The new moon appears. But it also has to do more with the fact that, in the evangelical Christian world, they're very, very into prophecy and scripture, more so than the Jewish world, believe it or not. Even though they're looking at our book, they tend to, I think, take it much more passionately and intensely than even a lot of Jews. And Jews, I think, over history have gone through so many misreadings of texts and false messiahs. I think Jews tend to be a little wary about trying to read into current events too much from the prophets. Although I have to say personally, when I'm reading these texts, I look for the big themes in the picture, and to me, I see very clearly how things are lining up. And the specifics, I don't know. If I was, I'd be a prophet. If I was a prophet, I'd be working in the stock exchange. Yes. But what I do see now very clearly is things are speeding up. There's a lot of stuff happening very quickly in terms of the world's economy and the geopolitical realities and how the world is dealing with Israel and ISIS. And the problem, with being in the middle of all these events is you need perspective in history to see how they shape up and how they affected the world. When you're in the middle of them, you tend not to see them. And if I could fast forward in history, 50 years, when we look back on this period of time, we're going to see that this was really one of the most tumultuous changes really since, you had big periods, the World War II and the Cold War, and we went through a period of half a century of a predictable reality of, superpowers of the Soviet Union and America, and then that ended in the 1990s, and now we're going through a massive change in the world, and I think Christians who are very much focused on apocalyptic themes. We had that in Judaism. They Christians got it from the Jews, but they tend to focus on it much more intensely and look for it, I think, more, scrutinize the texts more, looking for these signs in current events. And in the Bible, more than most Jews, even religious Jews tend to do, who tend to be focused on other things when they're reading the text.
Now, part of this blood moon idea would be then there's more on the horizon, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because we're hearing different things, and in a few months, partly because of the elections, that a war might start for whatever reason, maybe even as a political move. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, what possible things could occur in the next few months on a military standpoint.
Well, first of all, we know, on a military standpoint, we know that, Hamas is rebuilding, although I think they're kind of, going to be out of action for a while, although it's clear that they're already back in action. The immediate threats to Israel at northern border is Hezbollah. Hezbollah now is distracted very much so by what is going on in the Syrian civil war, because that's that axis of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. So the reality is, in many ways, Israel, in terms of real immediate threats, is actually in one of the best situations, because our enemies are all, basically killing each other off and distracted elsewhere. So in the short term, Israel, if you ask the generals, they'll tell you that there are no major strategic threats to Israel at the moment. The big one, of course, is Iran going nuclear, which we see also. Obama is desperate now that he's halfway through. He wants to get his name in the history books, and it seems that his goal will be to try and cut some deal with Iran to limit their nuclear program, although Iran, as the world experts, have stalling, buying time, and continuing to do exactly what they've done for years. And that's very, very dangerous, because that could be a situation where Israel could find itself being forced to act to attack Iran. And that is by no means a simple mission. Unlike Iraq in 1981, when Israel took out Iraq's nuclear program, that was in one building. It was a pretty brilliant play, but it's nothing compared to the Iranian nuclear program, which is far more sophisticated, far more dug in, and far better protected. And of course, the other point being is that could trigger a massive reaction from things like Hezbollah, which has they claim Hezbollah now maybe has 100,000 missiles or something like that. I've seen the statistics. They're pretty scary, that could reach all of Israel. So while immediately we can sort of, sit back and breathe deeply and relax a little bit, I'm sure that all the generals and the military planners in Israel are looking down the road at the scenarios that are shaping up. And again, coupling that with the ever-growing hostility towards Israel and the lack of support for any military action against Iran, we could be facing some very, very dangerous situations that could actually materialize pretty quickly, because Iran is really approaching its nuclear threshold. No one knows exactly, but they're continuing to use their centrifuges and try and create enough weapons-grade plutonium to make multiple warheads. So it's a very dangerous situation, and that could easily play itself out within a relatively short period of time. One thing about the Middle East is things can change very dramatically and very quickly.
Yeah, that makes a New York minute look like a baby in comparison. Again, this is a prophecy here on Israel National Radio, and our guest this afternoon is Rabbi Ken Spiro. Now, Rabbi Spiro, one of the things about this that you're describing is very scary, and people in Israel might think, man, maybe I got to just get out of here. What would you say if people think that about the safety-wise, about leaving Israel? Would you advise them to stay or leave? I'm sure I know your answer, but I want the audience to hear it anyway.
Yeah. So, look, it's sort of counterintuitive. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and there are 6 million Jews in Israel.
Right.
That in theory could be, God forbid, 1 million times obliterated in the push of a button. And, of course, anyone watching the news recognizes that Israel is under constant attack, and every day something is going on. And trust me, from my friends and who serve in the security forces, and from my children who serve in the military, everything you hear about, there's another 100 things you're not hearing about. There's a massive amount going on that we don't even hear about. So it might seem that logically the safest place for Jews to be would be to be as far away from here as possible. But I would say two things. Number one, if history proves anything in the last 100 years, it's although we have friends in this world, Jewish people cannot count on anyone but the creator of the universe and the Jewish people to protect us. to rely on non-Jews to protect us. We see how well that worked between 1939 and 1945. And at a deeper level, and this is the real point, the entire existence of the Jewish people is supernatural. The fact that no people has suffered more and been more subjected to attempted destructions and exiles, and the fact that we've outlasted the greatest empires and done things that are unprecedented and come back and reestablished the state. I mean, it's happened to us, so we say, well, it happens, but the reality is it hasn't happened to anyone else. All of Jewish history is really quite supernatural, and it is prophecy fulfilled. And it shows us, first of all, and it's not a leap of faith. It's a very logical point that there's a higher power protecting us, and we have a destiny. We're meant to be back here. And push comes to shove, although it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, the safest place on the planet Earth for Jews to be is always going to be the Jewish state. There's no question in my mind. And what we're witnessing now, by the way, is the only place you might possibly think of going outside Israel, okay, maybe America, Canada, as long as Stephen Harper, who I love, is still Prime Minister, and maybe Australia, although what's going on there, it doesn't seem so safe. But Europe we're watching the closing down of Europe as a refuge for Jews. This is what is happening literally every day. There are places in Europe you cannot walk around, and I'm not talking about little countries, you're talking about Paris and London, where you cannot walk around openly identified as a Jew because you will be verbally and possibly physically attacked. So it's clear in my mind as a rabbi and a historian that basically the diaspora is shutting down, and it's time for the Jews to come home. And I say the opposite. I say that I always tell this to groups when I'm teaching, when I'm guiding. I'm saying, it could happen any second. You're going to have to get back here. You don't want to make the mistake that Jews in Germany made. And even if you're not ready to, sell your house in the diaspora, move to Israel, at least get a piece of the rock. Buy that property now. I mean, the French are all getting all the good real estate. I tell my American friends, you're going to end up in a tent in the Negev desert because all the good apartments in Jerusalem and Netanya are going to be bought up by all the French in Marseille and Paris who are hedging their bets and all buying a piece of real estate in the Holy Land.
Well said. Now, something you said earlier when you were talking about it'd be pretty scary if we can't count on the United States, would that lend to the idea that partly when Mashiach comes, even maybe a little before, we understand that at the end of the day we can only rely on God, and that could even be part of the whole process of we can't count so much on other countries because at the end of the day that's a mirage. It's really God who does everything anyway.
For sure. I think, just because I say America is the last refuge, but it doesn't mean it's going to remain a refuge. And when I talk about this historical precedent of Jews being bounced from place to place, I say, well, what do you think a German Jew would have said in 1935 if you told them that 10 years from now there'll be no Jews left in Germany and most Jews in Europe will be dead because of Germany? They would have said you're out of your mind. So what seems to be improbable is very, very possible. And while we'll always have friends in this world, and I believe we actually probably now have more friends, I think, the Jewish people than could well be at any time in human history in terms of sheer numbers, although it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the people who are either neutral or hate us. We only can count on basically God to save us, and we need to act proactively to be ready to get out of there. I always say that the joke about Jews in America is like the guy who jumps off the Empire State Building. 50 stories down, he looks in a window and says, so far, so good.
Again, this is a Prophecy on Israel National Radio. A few minutes we have left with you. Let's talk about Hanukkah because this show is airing Friday during Hanukkah. And as the saying goes, as Shlomo Melch said, nothing new under the sun. When it comes to Hanukkah, we don't have to look at it as history. We can look at it as we're going through this right now. So tell us and tell the audience some of the lessons we can learn from the Hanukkah story that apply to us now.
Sure. Well, first of all, even a lot of, if Jewish listeners are confused about Hanukkah, some Jews I know think Hanukkah was created by the rabbi so Jews would get presents at the same time as Christmas, otherwise they might convert. Other people think, like everything in America is about freedom, so it's this holiday commemorating freedom from Greek occupation. The reality is the real focus of Hanukkah is it's a religious ideological struggle. Had the Greeks just allowed the Jews to do their thing, we'd already been living under Greek occupation since Alexander the Great's time for about a century and a half. It's only when the Greeks decide to embark on what is a culture conflict, really an ideological struggle, and it's history's first religious ideological war, to wipe out the only monotheistic belief system on the planet Earth. I mean, we Jews were quite unique at that time. Everyone else was swapping gods like baseball cards, and here were this one little people claiming that there's only one God, and everything else the world believes is a lie, and their absolute values, and we wouldn't marry their women and drink their wine and eat their pork, and the Jews were considered to be these obnoxiously elitist, different people, and So it's, first of all, an ideological struggle, and second of all, it starts out, and this is the point that's lost on many people, it started out first as an ideological civil war, which means that assimilated Jews who had left Judaism and gone to Greek culture, were the ones who launched the initial volley in this war. Now, while not physically attacking their other Jews, they went and sicked the Greeks on their fellow Jews who were not assimilating. And there's few things worse in history than Jews trying to out-Gentile Gentiles and being a Gentile. Sometimes they become the greatest anti-Semites. So it started out, first of all, as an ideological civil war, which when the Greeks were brought into it, became a physical struggle to destroy not Jews, but Judaism. Had the Jews just assimilated. It wasn't like the Holocaust, where Hitler wanted to kill the Jews. The Greeks were interested, had nothing against the Jews physically. They had everything against Judaism, spiritually and ideologically. So that's really the issue there. And this goes on until today, this ideological struggle. You know, we focus on the miracle of Hanukkah. You know, people are familiar with the holiday. It's the menorah, the seven-branch candelabra that was in the temple, where the oil, which wasn't enough, burned for 8 days. I mean, as miracles go, that's about the lowest level miracle you could think of in Jewish history. I think sea splitting and great civilizations being destroyed by supernatural plagues is far greater. So we need to focus on what is really the message of that miracle. And the light represents, first and foremost, spirituality, which the Greeks were trying to snuff out. And had they succeeded, there'd be no Judaism, no Christianity, no Islam, and probably no world today. And the fact that we triumphed, not just physically, because it was a long, bloody war. It was 25 years of on and off fighting, and even though eventually the Greeks basically made a non-aggression pact with us and left us alone, we only had 100 years of autonomy until the Romans came and subjugated us yet again. Repeat the entire process in the Bar Kokhba revolt. But the reality is what did survive, even though we will eventually lose our country, is the spirituality. And the way I explain it as a historian is we really, with the exception of Hanukkah, lost all the battles, but we won the war. And I said lost the battles. Ultimately, with the return of the Romans, who we rebelled more against than any other people, we will lose our country. We will lose, probably millions of Jews will be obliterated in a 70-year period in 3 great revolts. And we'll go into exile and suffer 2,000 years of persecution. But if we look what happened now, the Greek Empire is gone like my T-shirt. You see Rome's gone. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, they're gone. Their pagan, amoral belief systems are gone. And one way or another, billions of people today now believe in a worldview that is essentially Jewish, the idea of one God and one standard of morality and the destiny of the human race. And they believe in a deterministic worldview that the world is going towards a certain goal. There's an infinite intelligence that guides this whole process, and the whole human race is going to get there together. And the real question is people want to recognize that the Jewish people still have a major role to play. This is the guiding force. We introduced this concept to the world, and it's our job to bring the world to that final destination. And the real beauty of Hanukkah is to appreciate that spiritual power of the Jewish people is the real strength of the Jewish people, not physical power. And that spiritual impact of the Jewish people, despite all the Nobel Prizes and everything else Jews have done in this world, the real great contribution and the real goal of the Jewish people has always been a spiritual, moral, ethical vision to bring the world to a certain place that it still has to get to.
You know, what's also interesting is when you talk about the Maccabees, I think people have this idea that these guys were young 20-year-olds, 8-packs, long hair, whatever, and they just went in there and used their physical power. These were older gentlemen that were a bit frail. Some of them, big rabbis that fought in this war. So can you just talk about how much of a miracle it was that we were just able to survive against the Greeks?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. We're talking about also some of the Maccabees. I think Judah Maccabee, I love military history. I think he was quite a brilliant tactician, following the 2 great rules of all really successful military personalities, which is do the unexpected and always be on the offensive. And if one reads in the book of the Maccabees, the battles that he fought, he was outgunned. We're talking about the equivalent of Israel fighting NATO. I mean, completely outgunned. And Israel today is very well equipped. We're talking about badly equipped Israel fighting NATO, like 1948 style. Judah Maccabee's greatness was, just taking the fight to the Greeks. And if you read in the book of the Maccabees, the speeches that he makes, which are all about, don't be afraid. And this is right from the text of the Bible. Don't be afraid about the might of your enemy. The bottom line is it's own illusion. God runs the world. If he wants us to win, it's David and Goliath. And that's a real great example. So I wouldn't say it was definitely a bunch of old men who were, completely, physically out of shape. They probably had some good fighting Jews in there, but certainly were totally outgunned in terms of equipment, technology, little Israel fighting the great superpower of the ancient world, Greece. But it was not a miracle, a miraculous victory like we get Jews walk around Jericho, walls fall down. This was already in the Second Temple period. What we see the differences is we don't have these open miracles. God doesn't violate the laws of nature and swallow our enemies. The ground doesn't open up and things like that. The victories might be miraculous, but they're harder to see. And that's the whole idea of the theme of everything in the Second Temple period onward is the idea of Hester Punim, which begins with that story of Purim, where the Jews are miraculously saved by a series of coincidences which seem to be happenstance, which is one of the only two books of the Bible where God's name doesn't appear. Yet when we look back on the story, we see that his hand was behind the scenes manipulating everything to make it all work out. And that's a perfect analogy for the Hanukkah story, same thing. You know, we had to fight the battles. Many people died. It was a long, protracted war, but all the odds were against us, yet we won. And certainly that pattern holds true until today, that any number of things, 67 war, for instance, sure, you can explain this in that way, but the bottom line is there's no real explanation for any of Jewish history, not ancient, not modern. It's all, if you have the right lenses on, it's all examples of God behind the scenes, often hidden, yet setting things up to enable the great underdogs in human history to be so victorious and to outlast the great enemies who should have destroyed us so many times.
And something, again, certainly not new, little Israel against parts of the world. We're seeing that currently. Before we let you go, this has been a major honor, and I know that you have a website, kenspiro.com. You have great books out there, tours. Tell everyone where they can learn more about your work and what you do.
So it's actually interesting. Another good timing. I'm actually, I think today or tomorrow, launching my new website, which is also kenspiro.com, just a little more user-friendly and modern looking. But I have tons of content. I have audio, and you can read classes. I'm actually publishing very soon a book, which some of your listeners might be very interested in. It's called Destiny. And it basically deals with how all the plot of all the great Hollywood epics, you know, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, The Matrix, Harry Potter, they're all basically mirroring the reality of what human history and Jewish history is about. So it just shows that Hollywood echoes reality, and this is really the story of what the Jewish people have always been about throughout history, which is the ultimate story. So why escape to the world of fantasy when you can live the reality?
Great idea. And anyone also, if you're living in Jerusalem, see Rabbi Spiro lecture at Aish HaTorah. It's definitely worth it to go. Even if you're outside of Jerusalem, come travel. You're outside Israel, come travel, see him speak. And also, Rabbi Spiro is the author of Crash Course in Jewish History and Worldperfect, in addition to his new book that he is currently coming out soon. Again, kenspiro.com. Check out the website. Rabbi, thank you so much. This was really a pleasure and honor. We really appreciate the time. We know you're very busy. And happy Hanukkah to you and your family.
Thank you very much, and a happy Hanukkah to you.
Thank you so much. Be well. All right, that's the end of our program. Our guest this afternoon was Rabbi Ken Spiro. You can check out his website, kenspiro.com. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is It Prophecy on Israel National Radio. The show is simulcasted as Messiah Hour on YouTube. Email me, messiahhour@gmail.com. Happy Hanukkah and Shabbat Shalom.